Don Bluth Productions present a classic adventure in motion picture entertainment.
I must tell you about Nihm. Look there.
It's a fantasy with wizards and villains. And heroes.
I ain't scared of nothing. I'm not even afraid of the Great Owl.
Will you hush up? Come on.
It's an odyssey to another world. A world of fantasy and enchantment.
To what you see and hear, you must swear absolute secrecy.
It's the most beautiful sight I've ever seen.
Do you like me?
Of course I like you.
It's a story of friendship.
I mean, you don't think I'm clumsy or anything. What? I just need a few pointers to polish my style. I told you you'd love flying.
I don't know how I let you talk me into this.
It's a classic story of courage.
Why have you come?
And a world of danger.
If I had actually been near a cat, I'd be sneezing my brains out. I'm allergic to hay. Excuse me, pardon me.
Get out! Run for your lives! Run!
Where courage is rewarded.
Oh, thank you.
A motion picture for everyone to share.
Oh, the poor turkey fell down.
I'm not a turkey.
Big
No,
buzzard,
stop.
where's our
Get
mother?
down with her.
You better tell her.
Discover the secret of Nihm. And rediscover the child in us all.
Ciao, my people, and welcome to our 155th episode of Gold Standard, the Oscars movie podcast, where we travel through time, reviewing the films that earn their gold statue, or standard, if you will, and beyond. I am one of your co-hosts, DJ Nick, and as always, joining me at the Gold Standard Theatre is one of my two podcasting partners in crime, the Ghostwood Girl, Zan Sprouse. Hey, Zan, how's life treating you today?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing good. Weather been weird here in the Midwest, but it is not it's not plowing season, so I've been doing all right.
Very glad to hear that. Sadly, we are down a professional nerd, as Rachel sadly is down with a headache, and hopefully she will recover from it soon. But do not fret, dear listeners, she will return. But in the meantime, today we are reviewing a movie that Zan selected, and that is The Secret of Nihm. This was directed by the legendary Don Bluth, who co-wrote the story with John Pomeroy, Gary Goldman, and Will Finn. It was based on the 1971 novel Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nihm by Robert C. O'Brien, while the score was by Jerry Goldsmith. An estimate to put in today's money, adjusted for inflation, this movie cost $28 million to make and made $60 million at the box office. It was released on July the 2nd of 1982 and has a runtime of roughly 1 hour and 23 minutes. So, Zan, of course, you having selected this film, I'm sure you've watched this one multiple times. But yeah, what are your general impressions and thoughts on this film?
I love this movie. I chose this one because I wanted us to talk about a Don Bluth movie. And I've jokingly said before that if you grew up in the 1980s and 90s, if a cartoon movie scarred you, odds are it's a Don Bluth. Because Don Bluth not only did this movie, he did The Land Before Time, he did American Tail, he did Anastasia. Don Bluth is incredible. He is an incredible animator. He worked for Disney and then left to create his own studio to sort of get back to traditional animation. And you can tell in movies like this, the beautiful lighting of the rats lair is gorgeous. And that's Don Bluth's intent for his animation studio, is things like that light and color and just the beauty that traditional animation can really put on film. And from anything he did with that in the 80s too. Don Bluth also did I always like to mention this, Don Bluth did the animated sequence in the movie Xanadu, the Don't Walk Away sequence, where, we go from human to bird to fish. So there's water and light, and Don Bluth is incredible. He's still with us. He's a wonderful person from what I've gathered from his autobiography. Um, he seems like a very sweet guy and just very passionate about what he does. But yeah, there were some contributors to a lot of, scarred psyches in the 1980s. And this one's interesting because the year this came out was the same year as The Dark Crystal. So two movies that scared the crap out of me when I was a kid when I saw them, but that I still absolutely, absolutely adore. And this one was interesting for me because it was kind of my first foray into the more fantastical of stories. I'd always liked stories about animals like Charlotte's Web, for example, but these rats are something special. They're something very different, with their with with their, almost superhuman intelligence and strength and um their Yoda-like magic. So, I was not a lot of that kind of, I'm thinking of Rankin Bass Hobbit or the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings. A lot of that stuff when I was really little was kind of freaky to me. Kind of wizards were kind of scary. It's that damn Snow White witch. I think she scarred me. I think any sort of magical, witch wizard kind of thing just sort of freaked me out. Um even he's so altruistic of a character, but even Nicodemus, it, he's old, he's kind of shriveled, he's kind of mysterious. Speaking of the Dark Crystal, he's very Skeksis like almost. And I remember being 7 or 8 years old and watching, poor Nicodemus's lifeless body and just that absolutely scarring me for a long time. But I really do love this movie. And when you look at the reviews from the time, a lot of reviewers were saying like, what kids are watching this? Who is this for? Um, because it is based on a children's book. I'm not 100% sure, but I have a feeling that these, by calling her Mrs. Frisbee without actually spelling it, you probably were going to get in trouble with the Whammo company who created the Frisbee toy, which is a copyrighted term. So I'm guessing that's why she's Frisbee in the movie. I've always suspected that that was part of it. It was a children's book, but and I will say, I'm pretty sure Nicodemus doesn't die in the book. I've never read the book, but I don't believe there's the death in the book. But the plot is still very similar, where we have we all know what Nim is, and we'll get to that. And there's the farmer, and Nim is on to the rats. Where Nim's trying to find the rats and make sure that this experiment is never known by the public. So it's that kind of thing. But it does sort of start with, hi, welcome to our story. We've got a dead mouse, and here's his wife with a sick kid who might die. Like, welcome to the Tiny Tim plot kind of thing. So it is a very serious plot, and it's a very serious moral and social issue, which is animal testing. I mean, I'll just go ahead and say it right now. If you have not seen the movie, NIM stands for National Institute for Mental Health. These are lab rats and lab mice that have escaped. And I like to believe they are the inspiration for Pinky and the Brain, where they have super intelligence for rats. So that's a major, major thing to have to explain to children who are reading this book or watching this movie. What do you mean there's animals of all kinds in cages being tortured, whatever? And, I guess fortunately for the filmmakers, it was the 1980s and parents weren't paying attention to what the kids were watching or having any conversations with them about anything. We were just feral children in the 80s watching cable in the basement rec room, and nobody was any the wiser. Like, I'm not even sure my mother knows what this movie is. Like, that's how alone I was in watching these movies. I know she would have absolutely hated this movie. For several reasons, but it's very, very serious subject matter. Makes you wonder, who exactly is this for? And it's for everyone. It's for everyone who loves beautiful animation. And one of the things that animation does so wonderfully, which is point a mirror at humanity without using any humans. And what friendship and loyalty and morality, what's right, what's wrong. We're what exactly is stealing? Like, I wouldn't necessarily think Templeton the rat is stealing when he runs around the fairgrounds looking for food, but is it because it's electricity? Or even just things like when do we evolve into thinking we need clothes? All of these things that we think about with these rats and with these, unfortunately, just a couple of mice who make it out. There's a lot of things to think about with this and a lot of things to really challenge your idea of what's going on in the world and the things we don't see. And that's one thing that I really love about this movie is that there is this whole culture in society of, not just the rats and their super intelligent society, but Mrs. Brisby and her children and her wacky neighbor and the crows, all of these things where the farmers are just like, yeah, we've got rats, we're a farm. Rats come with a farm. Farms make food. There's rats there. The little things that we don't necessarily see as humans, that concept I think is fantastic. And I'm hesitant to say that this is Don Bluth's masterpiece because Anastasia exists and An American Tail is a fantastic musical, but this one is definitely my favorite Don Bluth. I think it's there's something about it. There's something about um the quaintness, the magic, and the morality, and the unseen that just really makes it something very special for me.
I 100% agree. I mean, this was a big part of my childhood too. I mean, I don't know whether my mother ever sort of sat down with us kids to see what we were watching, but she did rent this for us at the video store, and my sister and I definitely ate this up with a spoon. And it is curious that while we were reviewing this, I was mentioning this to you and Rachel, that I just got through listening to the audiobook version of Clive Barker's Cabal, which of course was then made into the movie Nightbreed. And I see so many similarities, albeit they're very different stories when it comes to what Nihm represents and what Midian represents in that story. And I was like, wow, I can definitely see some odd parallels there. But outside of that, there is something I agree quietly unsettling about this film in a way that most animated films never dare to be. It almost feels like a bedtime story told too late at night when the room has gone cold and the shadows start looking alive. It's not frightening in a cheap way, but it's very emotionally heavy, as you were saying. It's serious. Like it understands that fear is part of being alive, and it doesn't try to soften that truth for the audience. And what stands out to me the most about this is how sincere it is. The film never feels like it's trying to entertain first and mean something second. It very much commits completely to its atmosphere. The world feels damp and fragile and dangerous, and every gust of wind matters. Every creaking floorboard sounds catastrophic, and survival feels physical there, even exhausting. I mean, you can almost feel the mud and the rain clinging to everything. And like you were saying, visually, it's stunning in that old school hand-drawn way that carries imperfections like fingerprints. The glow effects, the darkness, the strange contrast between warmth and decay. All of it gives, I think, the film this dreamlike texture. Some scenes feel almost less like animation and more like half-remembered nightmares from childhood. And not the chaotic type, but the symbolic ones. The kind that stay with you for years without you fully understanding why. And what I really admire is its willingness, like you were saying, to trust younger audiences with very difficult emotions. Grief exists there. Illness exists there. Mortality exists there. You have exhaustion and loneliness and desperation and sacrifice. And the story treats these things seriously instead of hiding them behind jokes every few minutes. And I think that honesty gives the emotional moments real weight. When hope appears, it actually feels earned because the film allows darkness to exist first. And also, I would say there's this underlying melancholy running through the entire thing. A sense that intelligence and progress came with suffering attached to them. And that gaining awareness can separate you from the natural world you once belonged to. Also, I think this film brushes against ideas about ethics and cruelty and the cost of survival without turning it into a lecture. It just lets those themes sit there quietly under the surface. And honestly, that's probably why the film endures, because it respects the audience. It assumes people, even younger people, can handle ambiguity and sadness and beauty all at once. And it doesn't flatten itself into something safer or more marketable. It does feel handcrafted, deeply felt, and a little haunted. But some animated films age into nostalgia pieces. This one ages into folklore, just like The Dark Crystal. So I cannot say more great things about Don Bluth and his team and what they accomplished with, I think, a true masterpiece. So let's get to our characters on the board, starting with our heroine. We have Elizabeth Hartman as Mrs. Brisby, and sadly, this would be the last role that she ever did, unfortunately, because she would then commit suicide 5 years later. So, Zan, what did you make of this character?
I love this character because she's such a strong woman character to begin with. There's so little you see of her domestically when it comes to a mother character, which is not something we were necessarily used to at the time. She's a widow. Her husband's been killed. We find out later that she never particularly knew how her husband died, but the rats eventually tell her what happened. Her husband was Jonathan, one of the mice, along with, there were, I think, 10 mice that tried to escape with the rats from Nihm. And they were just, mice are smaller than rats. They just kind of got sucked up into the air duct, and only 2 of them survived, Jonathan and Mr. H's. And so another thing that interests me about her, first of all, like I said, she is a widow with 4 children, and her marriage must have been fascinatingly mysterious to Jonathan, because we find out as the story goes on that Jonathan never told her about his time in Nihm. And from what it sounds like, that experience turned him, we've seen stories about people who have gone through trauma like this before, institutionalized torturous trauma, and it can manifest in different ways. And the way Mrs. Brisby is just so sweet and so nurturing and so caring, yet so vigilant and understanding, that I would like to think that her marriage to Jonathan's experience in Nihm made him the type of person that is going to maybe make sure that his children never experience anything like Nihm, that he is going to get the love he was denied, and he was going to shield his loved ones from the terror that his life had been. And, it kind of makes you wonder, like, did you wonder how he learned how to read? It's interesting how there are these little insights into his mysterious past. She's like, oh yeah, reading. Jonathan taught me a little bit of that. And you just want to say, you're mice, right? Like when did this there was never a conversation of how did you learn how to read, babe? But maybe it was one of those things like, that's a story for another time, and you already had a couple of kids by then, and now it just wasn't as big of a situation. But it fascinates me, the type of person that she is and what kind of marriage she must have had to Jonathan, and how her children are such innocent, fun, sweet, loving children. They're so loving of each other. Her children, by the way, she has 2 boys and 2 girls. Her oldest son is played by Will Wheaton, and her oldest daughter is played by the late Shannon Doherty. And her youngest son has pneumonia. And when you think about pneumonia in humans, quick little story. I tend to get pneumonia every 10 to 15 years. And about 10, 12 years ago, I had pneumonia, and I was talking to my boss. He's like, hey, can we meet about something? And I said, I really can't. I have a doctor's appointment. I'm very sick. I need to go to this doctor's appointment. I'll keep you posted. I think it was a Tuesday. And as I left the doctor who diagnosed me with pneumonia, I had a doctor's note that had me out of work for the following week. I came home with a work excuse and a Z-Pack. And so I texted him a photo of my work excuse and my diagnosis. And I said, I have pneumonia. I'm going to bed. Is this urgent that you needed to talk to? He's like, absolutely not. Rest up. I'll talk to you next week. And when we spoke the following week, he said, yeah, after I talked to you, I Googled pneumonia, and I'm not going to tell you what I found out, Pneumonia is very, very frightening. Um, you can drown in your own fluids if you do not get pneumonia treated. Um, I'm not here to, I'm not trying to bash anybody's religion, but this is what killed Jim Henson, and I will never forgive pneumonia for that. Um, so if you have a rumbling, if you have rumbling breathing, please go see a doctor. And as a human, you can go get a Z-Pack, but you can't as a mouse. This is a big deal. And I love the fact that these mice have like their summer home for the plowing season. They just can't move their little boy. She can't move her little boy. So she's doing this wonderful, cute thing that I always love, like going to see your husband's friends that are like kind of taking care of your buddy's widow, where she goes to see Mr. Agee. Um, and I love Mr. Agee too. He's like, she asks him the question. He's like, it's not that important. I'm like, that's like extremely important, Mr. Agee. He leaves out so many little historical plot points. It's really kind of funny. um, Mr. Agee is a funny one for me too because and we can talk about him later, but or Mr. Ages, uh, he's in Halloween. So anytime I hear him talking, I just want to hear him say, "Why do they do it, goddamn kids?" Like that's what that voice means to me after seeing Halloween so many times. Um, but when she goes to see Mr. Ages, and not only is he able to give her medication, but he has that typical magical, fantastical library, type, wizard historian with the glass. Like, where are these mice getting the glasses? Where are they getting the clothes? Where are they getting the glasses? All of this stuff. So, she's trying to do everything she can, and part of her bravery is trusting people that you wouldn't necessarily think a mouse would trust. She's trusting the rats. She's trusting I don't I don't know who's our crow, Jeremy. I mean, everybody has I think they opened the book of J names and just okay, that's what our characters are. Everybody's a J name in this movie. I'm always like, who's Jeremy and which one? But yeah, Jeremy the bird. She's trusting a bird. She's trusting an owl. And I love, owls eat birds only after dark. All of those things. She's trusting people to help her because the alternative is unacceptable. And I think that's fascinating about her and her bravery. And then when she finds out about the rats of Nim and when she finds out about Jonathan's role in it and how these rats are trusting her and are willing to take care of her because of how much Jonathan had taken care of them, then she takes on Jonathan's loyalty to these rats and says, okay, I'll do it. I'll be the one that drags the cat, that drugs the cat, that drugs dragon. I'll do this because you're going to help me move my house so my child doesn't have to make the trek and we won't get plowed and my child won't die from the strain of pneumonia. What she's going through makes her so brave, and she has a lot to unpack in this. She finds out a lot of things. She's dealing with a lot in this. Hey, my kid's sick. Oh, by the way, here are some rats that have some news for you. She has a lot to process in a very small amount of time, and it's very, very stressful for her. And the fact that she is that kind of person who is able to weigh the options and trust in a situation where maybe somebody else wouldn't be so ready to trust because it's just not what you do. I think that's what gives her the power at the end of the movie to properly use the amulet that she got like 2 days ago and Yoda her house to wherever it needs to be. That beautiful scene where she's able, like, oh, also, any lock can open with the right key. Yeah, no thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, genius. No kidding. But still, it's a beautiful thing where she's like, something is locked. I need a key. I have the key. Let's do this. Because she has this quiet bravery of, I weighed the options of all of my bad ideas. This is the best bad idea. Let's do it. I'll drug the cat. I'll trust the owl. I'll listen to these people. I'll and if I have to have my racist ass neighbor babysit my kids while I do it, whatever, I'll do that, because I am not a fan of Auntie Shrew at all. She's you know, um Hermione Baddeley, fantastic. The maid in Mary Poppins, love her, but her character's so racist in this. It's ridiculous. Talking to the crow about what do you just want to not work and have everybody hand out things to you? It's like, oh my God, you guys, what are you doing with this character? But at the end of the day, everybody in this is like, okay, somebody has a sick child. We need to all pitch in and help out with that. But she has this, and I think that's the thing, we are Elizabeth Hartman, did she win the Oscar or was she nominated for uh Patch of Blue? She was nominated for Patch of Blue, where she's blind, she's kind of, that sort of meek, surprisingly deep character that she played in that story. She's kind of like that in this, where like, Mr. Aegis, my boy is sick, and then by an hour later, she's moving her home. Their home, by the way, is a cinder block, which I think is adorable. But I think her ability to do all of that and her ability to process everything, I think even though she does not have the chemically enhanced intelligence as the other rodents of Nim have, she's very wise and very strong and very brave. And I don't know, I personally think she could have made it across the kitchen floor totally fine with her cape on. I think Justin just wanted to get her naked.
That's a very good point. I think maybe that could have been the case.
Justin is totally macking on her, and he's like, "Oh, take your cape off. It might get caught in something." Whatever. I mean, and even when she is caught and she's essentially, 5 feet above the floor in a bird cage, naked and no resources, what's she doing? Still being vigilant. She's the one who overhears the phone call from the farmer saying that Nim is coming and they're going to find those rats and eradicate all evidence that those rats ever existed. And, part of her wanting to get out is now not just to save her son and her family, but also to save the rats that are helping her. Her moral compass is, spot on. She's a really strong, wonderful character.
Very much so. And it is interesting you point out the fact that so many of the characters' names start with J. It is curious because from basically our hero, if you will, to our villain, they all start with a J. I guess they did open the book and look at the J names and say, okay, we'll do that. But,
Jonathan, Justin, Jenner, Jeremy, like what?
Interesting. I wonder whether there's something there. I guess we'll have to sort of scour the interwebs and find out. Audio listeners, please let us know. But I certainly agree with you, Zan. Mrs. Brisby does feel very unusual even now, especially compared to the kinds of protagonists that animated films usually center around, because she isn't written as powerful in the obvious sense. She's frightened almost constantly, soft-spoken, physically small, hesitant, and that's exactly why she works so well, because her courage never comes from confidence. It comes from necessity. Because the film understands something a lot of stories miss. That bravery is much more meaningful when someone is terrified the entire time and keeps going anyway. And she doesn't become fearless. She doesn't suddenly transform into an action hero. Every dangerous decision still visibly costs her something emotionally. And you can feel her panic in nearly every scene. And I think that vulnerability makes her feel deeply human despite the fantasy setting. And what I also love is how maternal love is treated as genuine strength instead of background motivation. The story doesn't frame care, tenderness, or devotion as secondary traits. Those qualities are the source of her resilience. The entire film moves because she refuses to abandon responsibility, even when the world around her becomes incomprehensible and threatening. And to your point, I think there's also a kind of quiet dignity to her, because she spends much of the film surrounded by figures who are louder, more knowledgeable, more intimidating, or more outwardly capable. Yet emotionally, she becomes the center holding everything together. And not through dominance, but through persistence and empathy. And I love the fact that the film never mocks her gentleness. It respects it. And also visually and emotionally, she also fits the atmosphere perfectly because she looks fragile against the darkness of the world around her, which reinforces the tension constantly. You know, in another movie, that kind of character design might just signal helplessness. Here, I think it emphasizes endurance because she survives not because she overpowers danger, but because she keeps moving through it. And honestly, I think that's part of why she remains memorable, because she represents this quieter kind of heroism that animation rarely prioritizes anymore. You know, not charisma, not destiny, not spectacle, just love strong enough to push someone through fear again and again. And I think Elizabeth did a fabulous job of voicing this character, and I'm so glad that we got her to do this one. So let's get to some of the many members of Team Brisme and some fantastic actors voicing these characters. We have Peter Strauss as Justin, Derek Jacobi as Nicodemus, and Arthur Mallet as Mr. Ages. So what did you make of these three?
Let's start with our brother Cadful as Nicodemus. Nicodemus was one of those, like I said, as a child, who both captivated and terrified me. You know, seeing his his old hands over the amulet and his his wise nature, but he's still kind of on the brink of death. Nicodemus is not terribly strong at this point. There was just something so terrifying, but I can't look away about this character. And and unfortunately with this character, because he's older and because he's frail, he's probably the rat that's been in the lab the longest, and he's probably had the most done to him, and he is an incredibly tragic character. And the fact that he has this complex morality of thinking that it's wrong to steal resources from the humans like electricity, but at the same time wanting to go back to the life of being a rat, the life that they were robbed of by the humans. So there's a real complexity to his relationship to humans that I think is fascinating. And his idea of, yes, they turned us into something more evolved, but is it the life we were supposed to have? And that question sort of defines the Rats of Nihm, and it defines the conflict within the Rats of Nihm. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about Jenner, because Jenner also has a complex set of morality when it comes to the relationship to the humans. Part of me thinks if I had been a Rat of Nihm, I would steal literally everything I could from the humans. I would want retribution. I would want restitution. I would want reparation. I would want revenge, frankly. And Nicodemus is not just intelligent Nicodemus is intelligent from the experiments, but he is wise from experience. And that's what makes him the leader of the Rats of Nihm, because it's not just the default, he's the most violent or he's the oldest, but he really is very much the wisest. And Derek Jacobi, who I adore, who I always, I love his voice. I love seeing him. If you've never seen the Brother Cadfael mysteries, I highly recommend finding them. They're always very entertaining. The way he voices this character with such gravitas, but also with such melancholy and such exhaustion. The exhaustion of a long life, the exhaustion of a learned life, and the exhaustion of a life of conflict. It's really fantastic. The scene where Nicodemus tells the story of what Nihm is makes me cry. Every time I see it, just thinking about being a rat or any animal that does not yet have the intelligence to process what is happening to them, being taken and being turned into a lab experiment, and then having to go through terrible torture and see other animals that you wouldn't necessarily come in contact with go through terrible torture. It's really horrific. From a very young age, I was vehement about using as many products as I could that didn't use animal testing. I'm surprised I'm not a vegetarian. I'm close, but I'm not. After the amount of movies like this, with you would think that me crying at this movie with my Charlotte's Web tattoo, I would be a vegetarian, but I'm not. But that like 3 minutes of that story is so incredibly powerful and so emotional. Just and the way the animation is of the rats and just how they have that fear in their eyes of first of all, being kidnapped and then taken into this lab and then having the things done to them. And then the fear the rats have of what just happened to me. Why can I read now? Like that sort of overnight, they're not Neo where they all of a sudden are like, I know Kung Fu, teach me more. They're like, what in the world is this? And just, the fear of this new power they have and what's now available to them because as we were talking about earlier, Nick, um, George Orwell's not wrong. Ignorance is bliss. The more we know, the more we know that everything's chaos, that the world is chaos, humanity's chaos, just life itself, has, there are patterns and mathematical order to things in the world, but just life itself is chaotic in general. And so the fear they have in their eyes after even discovering that kind of a thing. And I love that moment so much where he's like, and then I realized I knew what the words meant, and he knew how to open the gates, open the cages. And then the fear of that, like, okay, I'm going to open this cage, and what comes next is all part of why Nicodemus now is just tired. He is such a, I mean, I jokingly say that Mrs. Brisby Yoda's her house where it needs to be, but he's kind of the Yoda of this situation. He's the one that's been around the longest, he's seen the most, and he's the wisest of them all. And again, like I said, I don't fault Nicodemus or Jenner with how they feel that the rats should live. I think both of them have valid points. Nicodemus saying that, yeah, we have all this stuff, but it's not the life of a rat. It's not the life we were destined for. It's not our true calling as rats. And Jenner saying, yeah, but we have this now. The humans gave this to us. Oh my God, they are Professor X and Magneto. I just thought about that. They're very much that kind of, it's like I get both of them. Like Magneto kills a little more people than I would be comfortable with, but Magneto's seen some shit, and I don't blame him for being suspect after what he's seen from not just being a mutant but also Jewish. And so I can see both of their points, but it's the whole like when you start killing people is when I start to pick one side over the other. Um, but it's like I get where he's coming from. Is that the only answer for how they're going to live their lives? No, because the thing is, they are super evolved, super intelligent rats now. They're too rat for the humans and too human for the rats. So they are their own thing. They can create their own thing. And, hopefully Justin's going to do that for them. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. Yeah, but he is very wise with, what's gone on. And again, I think he's probably where Jonathan d got his mentality of you can be like Jenner and you can let this poison you, or you can be a loving husband, you can be a loving father, and you can be a loyal friend, and you can choose to focus on the positive nature of your freedom now, as opposed to focusing on the insidiousness of your captivity. And I very much like that about Nicodemus. And like I said before, you kind of see both of their points, but you really hate Jenner because of Nicodemus. Um, Nicodemus probably had another week and a half in him as it was. This was not necessary. This was not necessary for what happened to him. Mr. Ages cracks me up. Like I said, I love his little librarian glasses and everything. Arthur Mallet is such a fun voice. He's also in Mary Poppins, like Hermione Baddeley. He's Dick Van Dyke's son when Dick Van Dyke is the old man who runs the bank. That's the Arthur Mallet character. But yeah, I love him constantly saying like, "Oh, let's not talk about that. That's not important." It's like, no, that's like the whole story here. What are you doing? And it's, his argumentativeness of like, what does somebody want from me now? And again, I feel like that's another way of dealing with the trauma these rats went through. Like, hey, I need something science made. Please give it to me. Here's one more creature that wants something born of science out of me. Like, here, fine, here's medicine, whatever. Um, but again, he's he's tired, but kind of in a different way. I think you can tell that he and Nicodemus are the oldest ones of this group. But he's a little like short, stout little guy, whereas Nicodemus is kind of thin and gaunt. So maybe he's not quite as old as Nicodemus. So maybe he still is. I don't know. I don't think there's the same desire that Nicodemus has to have the simplicity of the life of a normal rat. I think he digs being the doctor of this group, being the one people go to for intellectual answers. I think he likes that, even if he is sort of like, well, we are stealing stuff. But I think he like and Nicodemus as well, appreciates that they can write their history, that they can write these things down and keep this, and he can be the keeper of all of that. Even though Nicodemus was writing their history, Mr. Ages is who's keeping it. But yeah, he's he's kind of adorably like, what now? What now? What else can I possibly give to everybody at this point? So I think that's an adorable aspect of his character. And again, like I said, when I was talking about this movie initially, rats are not things that humans think about all that much. But the fact that this story gives them such distinct personalities is so fascinating. They are so very different. And Justin's just hilarious. Justin, oh my gosh. He's like he's half Prince Charming and half Gaston. He is adorable. He is, very obviously he's the brawn of this operation. He's the strapping, the strapping protective man. But he's, you know what? I take it back. He is the rat version of Captain Jack Harkness. He is such a flirt and such a pleaser. And again, you think about that in terms of surviving trauma, and some creatures, that's how they survive trauma. Um, Before we were recording, Nick and I were talking about cats, and cats who need something from you, like, that a cat needs you because they are extremely attentive and lovable. And that's kind of how Justin sort of seems to me. Like, I think that might have been his survival mechanism, to be personable, for lack of a better term. And maybe being big and bulky made things a little less painful. Maybe he's big and bulky because of what was given to them. Who knows? That's one thing that they don't really elaborate on in this, is exactly what the experiment was at Nihm. We just know that Nihm does not want anyone to know about it. And can you imagine being a farmer getting a phone call in the middle of the week? Like, yeah, so have you noticed any strange behavior with the rats on your farm? I don't know. What do you mean by strange behavior? I don't know. Like, are any of them wearing glasses and reading books and like sword fighting? Like anything like that? Have you seen any of that going on? Because, we don't think it's anything serious, but, call us if you notice it. So, like I said, all of these rats sort of seem to be coping with their trauma in different ways. Their personalities seem to be coping with their trauma in different ways. And as much as everyone seems to have a reverence for Mrs. Brisby because of the reverence they had for Jonathan, I think he does especially. And, I always sort of got the feeling that Jonathan and Justin were probably pretty friendly with each other. They were probably friends. Not such good friends that he's not going to move in on his widow now that she's, well, it's like, nice to see you, my lady. This lovely woman here needs our assistance, gentlemen. He's very, and even at the end of the movie when they do move to what is it, Thorn Valley? I forget what they call it.
I think it is Thorn Valley, yes.
Yeah, when they move to Thorn Valley, which again, more rose bushes. Probably. And one of the daughters says, "Will we ever see them again?" She's like, "Oh, I don't know, maybe." I'm like, "Oh, what, you mean Friday?" Like, I have the feeling that she and Justin are keeping in touch with each other. But I feel like Justin is sort of in between our two conflicting factions within our rats. I think he's somewhere between Jenner and Nicodemus with his morality of what are we supposed to do as rats? What are we supposed to be? And he also understands that, we're going to make it look like nobody was ever here. We're going to keep our, Thorn Valley. They're going to, hide their tracks so Nim won't find them. Like, he understands the importance of not being a rat that calls attention to its behavior, because that's how Nim's going to find them again. I think they all understand that they are, fugitives from science, essentially. I don't think he's doing this just because it's what Nicodemus wanted and what Jenner doesn't. I don't think that's where he's going with it. But I think there's something in between, that there is something to be said for the intelligence that we have from our experience. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that. We shouldn't feel that we need to hide that part of ourselves. But should we be stealing this electricity and making us extremely well lit and extremely conspicuous? I think he understands all of that as well. So I think Justin's sort of in between the two of them, and just adorably charming. And Peter Strauss just kills it with the voice work on this. If you don't know Peter Strauss, yes, you do. You've seen him, you've heard him, he's been around, he's wonderful. And I love this idea of mice and rats aren't usually hanging out together all that much, but he doesn't care. Mrs. Brisby's a pretty lady. And her husband was my buddy, and I know he's dead, so I know she's single. And his he's their flirting is adorable. And I remember when I watched this movie when I was a little older and noticed their flirting, I was like, are you kidding me? He just died. Come on, man.
The sheets aren't cold yet.
I know, right? My God, at least let the kid get over the pneumonia first. She's got enough to deal with without you coming around going, take off that cloak, you're gonna catch it. And then I was seriously watching that today, and I'm like, he's just trying to get her naked. That's all he's trying to do. But yeah, I do feel like he's somewhere in the middle of understanding that they both have points about what they're supposed to be. And I like to believe that when they go to Thorn Valley, they figure out the happy medium of what they are, because nobody knows what these rats are supposed to be, because there's nothing like these rats in the world. They're the only ones like themselves. And the only thing we do know is that what Nim thought they were supposed to be does not have to be their destiny, that they can have their own destiny. And they can be the extremely special and extraordinary in between creatures that they are now. Like I said, they have sword fights and wear clothes and read books, unlike other rats, but unlike humans, they're still rats. They still had a destiny of a life that is still inside of them. The instincts that rats have is still there for them. And I think Justin is also, like I said, more of the let's move on with a positive, kind-hearted, unlike Jenner, who I think is just sort of trapped in his bitterness about it all. But, and even when, who's Justin, the leader of the rats? Like, he just sort of becomes the leader of the rats because, it's Mr. Ages doesn't necessarily want to be the leader of the rats. He's not particularly interested in that. And, Sullivan, who figures it out, Sullivan, who is sort of, Jenner's toady, essentially. He's like, I can't do this. I cannot kill Nicodemus. It's just wrong. And he's like, what do you got? No taste for blood? It's like, no, I don't. Like, what? How is that a personality failing? But he's very obviously a follower. We've got Mr. Aegis, who's maybe a little bit older, and then you have, Sullivan who does, spoiler, vanquish Jenner, but that doesn't make him, he's not the new head. He didn't cut off the head to just be the new one. He did it because he had to stop the monster. He didn't do it because he wanted to take the place of the monster. So yeah, Justin's the obvious choice.
He most certainly is. And I love that comparison that you made when it came to Captain Jack Harkness, because he very much is that for sure. Because he does have very true. And, and Peter does a great job voicing him, because he does have this calm, almost storybook knight quality to him that could have easily become bland, but somehow it doesn't, because he does feel reassuring the moment he appears. He's steady, he's honorable, he's patient. And I think in a film filled with fear and uncertainty, he represents stability. And what I like is that his kindness never feels performative or exaggerated. He does treat vulnerability seriously, and there's a gentleness in the way he carries himself that makes him feel trustworthy rather than merely heroic. But like you were pointing out, Zan, at the same time, I think there is a sadness underneath him too. Like someone who understands the world is changing in ways he can't fully stop. And he belongs to the more romantic side of the film's fantasy elements. He's noble without becoming arrogant, and he's capable without overshadowing everyone else. And I think he gives the story warmth when it risks becoming overwhelmingly bleak. Nicodemus, on the other hand, to your point, feels almost mythological. Less like a person and more like a figure pulled from an old legend, almost a Gandalf kind of character, because the film surrounds him with this aura of age and wisdom and mystery that borders on the spiritual. Even his scenes feel slower, quieter, heavier compared to the rest of the movie, like time itself bends around him a little. And what I think, as you were mentioning, makes him memorable isn't just the wisdom. It's uncertainty. There's a sense that he sees far more than he can explain, and that knowledge has become isolating. He carries the burden of understanding things that others either fear or misuse. And the movie never fully demystifies him, which I think was very smart. Explaining him too much would weaken the atmosphere around him. He does represent enlightenment mixed with melancholy, almost like the film asking whether intelligence inevitably creates distance from innocence. And visually, he's one of the strongest embodiments of the movie's tone. The candlelight, the shadows, the deep reds and golds, the silence. Every scene around him feels sacred and slightly ominous at the same time. Whereas Mr. Ages might actually be one of the most grounded presences in the entire film, because he does feel practical in a world drifting toward myth and abstraction. He's irritable, he's exhausted, he's stubborn, but yes, he's deeply competent. And there's something believable about him in a very lived-in way, because he doesn't speak like a mystical guide or a grand hero. He sounds like someone who has simply survived long enough to lose patience with nonsense. And I think he adds texture to the film because he makes the world feel functional and tangible, because you do believe that routines exist there because of characters like him. Medicines need preparing, injuries need treating, problems need solving without dramatic speeches attached. And I think that realism helps balance the larger fantasy elements. But underneath the gruffness, I think there's real compassion. He does care intensely. He's just not sentimental about it. And honestly, that restraint makes the moments where concern breaks through feel more genuine. He is the kind of character who expresses loyalty through action long before words. So together, I'd say these three create different forms of guidance within the story. One represents moral steadiness, one represents wisdom touched by tragedy, and one represents practical endurance. They each pull the film into slightly different emotional register, which is part of why its world feels so layered and alive, because of these characters. So let's look at two of our other two significant characters. We have the wonderful Dom DeLuise, who of course we discussed here when we talked about Fatso, as Jeremy, and Hermione Badley as Auntie Shrew. So what did you make of the Crow and the Shrew, Zan?
Oh, Auntie Shrew is so terrible. She is a sort of typical small town nosy neighbor gossip, judgmental. She's racist. I have to say that I very much like the crow characters in this movie moved so far away from Disney's most famous portrayal of crows from Dumbo. They both crows are voiced by white actors. Jeremy is like you said, the wonderful Dom DeLuise, and Miss Wright at the end. He is the lovesick crow. Miss Wright at the end is Edie McClurg. From everything. She was part of the Groundlings. She's in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Edie McClurg is fantastic. So, but that there's such a cringe factor of the crows in Dumbo that I like that they sort of moved away from that in this. Even if we do have, Auntie Shrew is kind of a racist with the things that she said. I was watching it today, having never really paid attention to it, but just, you think you shouldn't have to work and the world just hands you things? I'm like, are you kidding me with this right now? But was that necessary? I don't think so. I'm sure there was another way we could have shown that, Auntie Shrew is maybe not the best choice of people to leave your kids with. But I feel like Auntie Shrew has two purposes. One, for us to get to hear Hermione Badley, who is fabulous. I always love to see her and hear her. And second, to remind us that sometimes our community isn't who we would necessarily want and isn't always who we think is the best option. But at the same time, they're part of our community and we all have the same goal. Psychopaths notwithstanding, most people do not want children to die of pneumonia. And no one wants their home to be plowed over during plowing season. So we all have a common goal. And sometimes, like I was saying with Mrs. Brisby, sometimes you have to make brave decisions that aren't necessarily ideal, of like who to leave your kids with. But, the nice thing about these kids is that they're sweet kids. They're not really learning anything from her. She's just kind of crazy old, Auntie Shrew. Jeremy, on the other hand, is adorable. I love that he's Dom DeLuise. I adore Dom DeLuise. When he does, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but his son Peter DeLuise is coming back for Spaceballs 2 as the son of Pizza the Hut, because he was the voice of Dom DeLuise was Pizza the Hut in the original movie. He's wonderful, and there's an innocence to him that he doesn't know that he's not supposed to be friends with a mouse. And part of that, again, is that sometimes your community is someone that shares a common goal with you. And mice and birds do not want to run afoul of Dragon the cat. So, they have their own things. She needs help sometimes. He needs help sometimes. He doesn't necessarily come through with the amount of string that he was supposed to bring, but it's kind of adorable. He's definitely the comic relief, but he's also an in for her to get her in to see this owl. Not only is she Jonathan's widow, but she knows she's friends with another bird, so he's able to bring her to someone that she didn't even necessarily know she needed to see. And, again, is able to help her through a situation where she needs to be brave in a way that isn't necessarily the best idea for her at the time. Like, she's not wrong. Owls eat mice. She's 100% correct on that. And, I love his not after dark. Owls are nocturnal. That's when they eat. That is hilarious. But these two characters sort of come together to make you realize that sometimes help and friendship come in places you don't expect them to. And like I said, I like that the core driving force for Jeremy's character is that he's lovesick. It's like, why am I saving this string for a love nest that I'm never going to meet anybody? That's kind of cute, I think, for him that he's the lovesick crow. I love how he turns into Gollum though when he sees the amulet, and because that's what crows do. Crows like shiny things. They like if crows are fascinating creatures. Crows can be loyal to you if you feed them and care for them. They will bring you presents. Often it is shiny things. People have often gotten gifts from crows that are old mylar balloons because they're shiny. And how he says, "I've always wanted a shiny for my own." It's a very Gollum moment for him. And at the end he's like, "Give me the shiny. What are you doing to me? I need the shiny. I need to give it to this girl." And she's like, "Oh, I gave it to Justin." I'm like, "Oh, really? Okay, so you and Justin are exchanging jewelry now. I understand how this works." But I think he's adorably a crow. He's just a crow. He's not a metaphor for something that Disney wanted to exploit a stereotype about. He's the stereotype of a crow, which I think is adorable. Um, and again, this goes back to other other stories where mice are little. If they need to travel, they need to be friends with a bird. That's what the Rescuers was all about. They've got their albatross buddy whose name I can't think of off the top of my head. But yeah, sometimes when you can have a common goal and everyone comes together, there's for creature manity, not just humanity, creature manity. You can meet people and have friends in many different places, and I really love that about the Jeremy character.
I totally agree. It would have been interesting had they made him even a magpie, bearing in mind the whole shiny thing, but it is true when it comes to crows. They are fascinating creatures. And I say this as somebody who is literally surrounded by crows, and we have quite a big crow community in this area and they literally have because they're very territorial. They're literally frightened off almost all the other species when it comes to the bird community. But yeah, I agree with you. I love that this is Dom DeLuise, and of course Dom would then do more work within the Dom Bluth universe, which is wonderful. And he's such an important presence because he prevents the film from collapsing entirely under its own heaviness. Without him, the atmosphere might become almost unbearably tense. He brings that awkwardness and that warmth and this frantic, chaotic energy that feels genuinely alive rather than artificially comic. What I think makes him work for me is that the humor comes from personality and not from the movie suddenly abandoning its tone. He isn't there to mock the story or break immersion. He still feels like he belongs in the same dangerous world as everyone else. He's just painfully unequipped for it. And there's something very endearing about how hard he tries, despite constantly fumbling everything. And, and underneath the nervous chatter and the comedic panic, he's very sincere. He's loyal and he's earnest, and he wants to help even when helping terrifies him. And because the movie is so emotionally serious overall, that sincerity matters. And I do think that a more cynical film would probably turn him into pure comic relief or humiliation material. Instead, the story allows him dignity. Honestly, he also has a kind of emotional realism. Not everyone responds to fear with stoicism or wisdom. Some people ramble and panic and overcompensate and make mistakes. And his anxiety, I think, makes the world feel more believable because it reflects how overwhelming these events actually are. Now, Auntie Shrew, meanwhile, she's one of those characters who appears briefly, yet I think leaves a massive impression because her personality is so forceful. She storms into scenes like a tiny natural disaster. She's sharp and she's loud and she's overdramatic and completely unconcerned with politeness, as you were saying, Zan. And somehow she becomes hilarious precisely because the film around her is so restrained and atmospheric. But beneath that comedy, I think she serves another purpose as well. She reinforces how dangerous the outside world really is. Her paranoia sounds absurd at first, but the movie quietly suggests she isn't entirely wrong to be terrified all the time. In a gentler story, I think a character like her would just be comic exaggeration. Here, she feels like someone whose fear has been sharpened into aggression by constant survival pressure. And there's also, I think, something memorable about how unapologetically abrasive she is. The film doesn't soften her into a sweet eccentric. She's difficult and impatient and reactive and exhausting. But that roughness gives the world character. Everyone in the movie feels shaped by hardship in different ways. And with her, it manifests as perpetual outrage. So I'd say these two characters help balance the emotional texture of the film. One brings this anxious kindness and nervous humor, while the other brings explosive panic and abrasive energy. And both keep the movie from becoming emotionally one note, while still fitting naturally into its strange, haunted little world. And it's wonderful to have folks like Hermione, of course, and Dom on this project. So let's round off our characters with our main villain, or is he a villain? We have Paul Shinar as Jenna. So Zan, you were alluding to this character who's very multifaceted. So what did you make of him?
Yeah, very most. Before that, I want to go back to what you were saying about Auntie Shrew. In a more quaint movie, she'd be the goose from Charlotte's Web. She'd be Agnes Moorehead's goose. She's that kind of feel. But yeah, these are women characters that are not what we're used to with women characters in family movies, animated movies. Definitely, they seem like they are, but when you really look at them, they're very different and they're very multifaceted. Okay, Jenner's a tough one. I have a hard time forgiving Jenner for Nicodemus, because not only does he kill Nicodemus, he's endangering the Brisby family. That's their house. He Wicked Witch of the East's him. He drops their house. He makes sure that the house they're using ropes and strings as pulley systems. These are very smart rats, people. I mean, we're talking, those basketball playing rats. You haven't seen anything yet. I do love the basketball playing rats though. But anyway, bit of trivia: if you've ever seen a rat that plays basketball, usually the basketball is the ball roller from some deodorant that has holes in it. Because it's light. It's rat shaped, or it's rat sized. But yeah, it's a deodorant ball. Anyway, he's putting the Brisby family in danger too. So he really does not have. He doesn't really have anybody's best interest at heart. He has what he thinks is right at heart, and what he thinks is right is not necessarily anybody's best interest. Like I said, I get it with him. I get that he's been through a lot. There's a lot of trauma and anger in Jenner, and I understand why. That's the interesting thing about him as a villain, is that he makes perfect sense. Of course he'd be a villain. With what happened to him, it makes perfect sense that he'd be a villain. But we also have seen all these other people, or all these other rats, that the same things happen to. Maybe different things happen to Jenner, I don't know. But insidious things happen to all these rats, and not all of these rats are like Jenner. Jenner is most definitely a bully. He's sneaky, he is duplicitous. He has a little toady. Sullivan is his toady, and I definitely want to bring up Sullivan too, because Sullivan's kind of, he has one very heroic moment in this, and Sullivan is also he's voiced by the actor Aldo Ray, who is Twin Peaks royalty adjacent. He was married to Joanna Ray, who has done casting work for David Lynch through numerous projects. And he is the father of Eric Dare. His original last name is Dare. He's the father of Eric Dare, who is Leo Johnson, who is, if you've ever heard me and Charles talk about Twin Peaks, our most hated character in the entire series. He's quintessential villain. He's the perfect villain you love to hate. But, he has this little toady of like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. And he's obviously not friends with Sullivan. He's not nice to him. He sort of insults him all the time, and, questions his intelligence and his bravery, which, he's thinking killing Nicodemus is a brave thing to do type of thing. He's just such misplaced misplaced morality, I think, with him. But like I said, I get why he is this way. And I get, there's part of him where you listen to him and you're thinking, are you just doing this because it's what you've always done? Not wanting to leave where they are because that's, you know, where we are is who we are. It's the first thing they did after they escaped, and this is where they'll evolve more. Or do you not want to because you're afraid of what's inside of you? Are you afraid you could survive as the as a rat in the natural order of the life of a rat? Like, do you think you have that in you? And I think there is a fear of that he anger, usually sustained anger, things like, Count of Monte Cristo type of anger, puts your life and your development and your evolution and your growth completely on pause, because all you can do is focus on the anger. Anger should be a reaction and not a sustainable mode for yourself. I'm one of those people that burns white hot when I'm angry, and then I'm over it and I need to move on. And, his anger sort of defines him, and he's not understanding the things like I've mentioned before, that like, look, yes, I understand that you have a very interesting culture here in your roses, in your rose bushes. Nihm knows where you are. Nim's going to come cut you down. You are stealing electricity, which means somebody at some point is going to come look at why there's so much use. Why is a farmhouse using this much electricity? And your rats wearing clothes with lights on. You are going to be found out. This is not what they're doing, where they're doing it, and the way they're doing it is not sustainable for them to go unnoticed. And if they are noticed, it's going to be bad. Nihm possibly will bring them back and do more experiments on them. More likely, Nihm is going to eradicate them, because that's what they say they're going to do on the phone. I love the farmer, like, oh yeah, come on and eradicate those rats and get rid of those rose bushes, that you're going to pay for all this, right? I love the farmer. It's like, this is all free of charge to me, isn't it? He's thinking like, oh great, I can get those old rose bushes out of my way and maybe send the rats scattering for a while. It's like he's sort of focusing too much on, he's clinging too much on what they have. And I think he is clinging to what they now have, because I don't know how to put this. I've been trying to think of how to articulate this all day long. What these rats have been given by these experiments has made them so much more evolved than the humans that experimented on them, because these are rats who now can read and write and have understanding, and that's so beyond the life of a typical rat. And it's it's exponentially beyond what humans are also. Humans have not evolved as much as these rats have. From whatever they've learned from the rats is nowhere near how far the rats have grown, if that makes any sense, in exponential comparison. So like I said, he is the Magneto of this whole thing. He's like, no, they can do whatever they want to us, but we're better than them. We are better than them. We are better than the other rats. And he has that need to feel superior, because if he is going to deny his superiority, then what was all of this for? What was all of this torture for? And he can't get around that. And he can't see that, like I said, like Nicodemus, not living terribly long. It's interesting, like I said, that this and the Dark Crystal came out the same year, because these rats and Skeksis kind of look the same. And when the leader of the Skeksis is dying and they're trying to take his scepter before he's dead and he's grabbing it back, he's like, I'm still emperor. It's like, they don't need to kill that guy. He can't get out of bed. And I feel like Nicodemus is the same way, that, there's no reason to kill him. I don't think he's going to last very long. But at the same time, I don't think Jenner has it in him to be the leader that Nicodemus was. I think he can bully somebody like Sullivan into being, being his minion, but I don't think he can lead a group of people. I think that's another reason why he wants to stay where he is, because he knows what to do there. and he doesn't know what to do when they go to Thorn Valley. He doesn't know how to let go of the rat he's become in order to become the rat that he was born to be. He's clung to the idea that he was born to be the evolved creature that he is, to the point that he has like vilified the natural rat inside of him. You know, that he's now seeing becoming what he was meant to be as going backwards, because what's keeping him going is that idea that he's better than everyone. He's better than the other rats, and he's better than the humans that turn him into what he is. And he can't let go of that. He absolutely can't let go of that, to the point where he can't see, or chooses not to see, that mistreating other creatures to the level that he does means he literally can't turn his back on anybody, because it's not, when they have their big fight, remember, these are super intelligent, genetically altered rats. They're gonna figure out his plan, right? So, of course, Justin figures out what happened, that it was not an accident. He killed Nicodemus. They have their fight. Now it's not just killing Nicodemus. Now we're going to kill probably Justin as well, and whoever else gets in his way. And you might think Sullivan's loyal to you, but he's only loyal to you because you've berated him into thinking that he has to be loyal to you. That's what bullies do. And you literally can't turn your back on anybody, because everybody's looking for a way out of having to interact with you and having to be under your thumb. And Sullivan is no exception. Sullivan, even though he accuses Sullivan for not having a taste for blood, Sullivan is who kills him. And he literally and figuratively stabs Jenner in the back. Jenner is about to kill Justin. Sullivan sees it and he throws a dagger at him and he kills Jenner, which, when you're 7, is terrifying. That scene is terrifying. With his eyes bulging out and falling off of, it looks like a cliff, but let's be honest, it's probably just a little rock in a garden. The rats, they're small. It's not a huge amount of space. It was very scary, and it for all of you kids who are younger than me, remember when shit started to get real with Rasputin? This is the beta version of that. That's kind of what this felt like to me as a child. So he's bullying everyone into his way of thinking, but he's not gaining anyone's loyalty at all. And so, like I said, this society that they've created for themselves, they need someone like a Justin who can understand both sides of the coin, but who can maybe, execute the plans a little bit better. Because, again, like I said with Nicodemus, I get where he's coming from, but he's older. Maybe some of these rats don't remember what it's like to be rats and like forage for food and, not get eaten by owls or other predators, that kind of a thing. Maybe it's not going to be that easy. But again, stealing electricity, and like I said, that's an ambiguous moral situation in my opinion. It's like, how much electricity can rats possibly be using? I feel like that's the difference between me having like a couple of nightlights in my house or not. How much are they? Is there like a rat data center for the rat AI that's going to be? It's not really using that much electricity. But I understand where their morality is coming from. But yeah, it makes them really, really conspicuous. When you've got Nihm asking around, are the rats acting weird? It's like, I don't know, but lights come on in the rose bushes. Maybe that's them. You can't really, they should, frankly, and Justin would probably like this, they should probably all be naked, because they really look like very strange, super evolved rats in their, in their, in their fantastical, magical outfits that they have. They're making themselves very conspicuous. But then at the same time, when you think about who bullies really are underneath it all, bullies are scared. And Jenner is very obviously scared. He's scared to face what he's been through. He's scared to face change, and he's scared to face anything different than the identity he has constructed for himself with the protective shell that is superiority. And he's terrified of all that to the point where he's willing to not just kill Nicodemus, but kill Justin, any other rats that get in his way, and endanger, little, I mean, his name is Timmy. He's like the Tiny Tim of this story. Endanger the mice, including the sick mouse that we're doing this whole thing in the first place for. Like I love that the Brisbys have a summer home. They would just go to their summer home if they could, but they can't. That's why they're moving the house. And when someone is that much of a, chaotic unknown, they're not able to lead. They're not able to, cooler heads will prevail. And, does he need to die necessarily? Yes, because of Nicodemus, he needs to die, but, he needs to not be the way he is, frankly. I don't know how there would be a way to, like I said, I need to read the book. There's got to be some way to knock him down a peg without the chaos that he ensues. But yeah, this kind of character can't be relied on. He's never going to get the chance to be the elder that Nicodemus was either. There's going to be something chaotic about him that is going to make him make rash and bad decisions and dangerous decisions that, he's, but yeah, I do feel like the storytelling rules of the bad guy can't win. He does need to die, and I do love the poetic justice of him literally being stabbed in the back by the one person who he thought was on his side, but it's only because he bullied somebody into agreeing with him. So he's a fantastically complex character, so well done, so terrifying. And like I said, with these rats, it's just such a wonderful exploration into how trauma gets processed differently from creature to creature.
I definitely agree, and I am definitely. I also want to explore the books. Once I've now finished my Lovecraft phase. I'm now on a Clive Barker phase. Once I end that, I think I'll explore the universe of Mr. O'Brien and see what these books are like. But I agree with you, Zam, because Jenna is fascinating because he doesn't feel evil in a theatrical, larger-than-life way. He does feel coldly believable. The film presents him less as a monster and more as someone who has completely surrendered to fear and pride and survival instinct until those things hollowed him out morally. What I think makes him unsettling is how controlled he is, because he rarely explodes emotionally. He doesn't need to dominate every scene through sheer noise or intimidation. Instead, there's this calm cynicism to him. Like he's already concluded that ideals are weakness and compassion is naive. He carries himself like someone who believes intelligence naturally entitles the strong to rule over the fearful. And in the movie so deeply concerned with ethics and the consequences of higher awareness, he becomes almost the dark reflection of everything the story is wrestling with. I mean, the film asks, what happens when beings gain knowledge, power, and self-awareness beyond their natural place? And his answer is essentially domination, self-interest, and paranoia. And he represents intelligence stripped of empathy. I mean, visually, he's perfect for the movie's atmosphere, too. There's something severe about him, sharpness everywhere, his silhouette, his expressions, his movements. Even when he's standing still, he feels dangerous in a calculating way rather than a feral one. And the film uses shadows around him brilliantly. He often seems partially swallowed by darkness, like the world itself no longer fully trusts him. And what I especially appreciate is the story doesn't reduce him to simple greed. There's resentment inside him, bitterness, a sense that he views the world as fundamentally cruel and therefore believes cruelty is merely realism. And in his mind, I think morality is probably just another comforting illusion that weaker people cling to. And that worldview, I think, makes him more compelling than a straightforward villain. He feels ideological. He genuinely believes that softness leads to extinction, and which I think creates a strong contrast with the film's quieter insistence that compassion and sacrifice are not weaknesses at all, but the very things that make survival meaningful. So honestly, I think he contributes heavily to why this film feels so emotionally mature. The conflict isn't just good versus evil. It's hope versus cynicism. It's mercy versus control, or even community versus fear. And he embodies the temptation to abandon humanity, emotionally speaking, when the world becomes painful enough. So another very memorable character in an incredibly memorable movie. So let's get to how our movie ended. Of course, the Brisby home begins to sink into the muddy ground, and Mrs. Brisby and the rats are unable to raise it. All appears lost until Mrs. Brisby's will to save her family suddenly gives her power to the amulet, which she uses to lift the house and move it to safety. The next day, the rats, with Justin as their new leader, have departed for Thorn Valley as Timothy begins to recover, while Jeremy meets and falls in love with an equally clumsy female crow. So how did you make of how our movie ended?
This ending is very different than the book. There is really not the magical amulet kind of stuff going on in the book. From what I've gathered, like I said, I haven't read it, and I might go look for it this weekend just because I would love to finally read this. It's one that I've sort of avoided because I know this story makes me sad, but it won't scare me because there's illustrations, but there is not Don Bluth animation. Nothing scares a kid like some good Don Bluth animation. But like I was saying earlier with Mrs. Brisby, I love that her quiet bravery culminates in this heroic moment for her saving her house. She didn't necessarily need the rats' intelligence. She needed the rats' lore. She needed to know who the rats were and the relationship with her husband and, the power behind that amulet that they have. And the fact that she was able to do that is, I think, a great metaphor for what we're capable of when we have a dire need and we really don't have a choice not to do something. Because if the house stays where it is, it's a problem. And her family's in danger, her child is in danger, everyone is in danger. She absolutely has to do this. And I think the fact that she's in this situation with these rats, with this amulet, and with all of this information is just almost like, her family legacy. Jonathan left such a legacy behind, and how they probably learned from each other as a married couple on, how to, I mean, they're mice. I'm sure they see adversity. Owls exist. How to handle adversity with quiet bravery, and and how to be parents with a quiet, steady sense of bravery and level-headedness. And, even when this is happening, like I said, it's very much like Yoda getting the X-Wing out of the swamp. He's just sitting there, and she's just sort of there with, her eyes are glazed over and her mouth is open. And it's not this, not this strenuous thing. It's just a moment of zen, and, sometimes your inner strength just takes over and gets everything done. Like I said before, I think because of Nicodemus, Jenner does have to die. It's just too much sabotage for him to be allowed to stay alive in this story. I like that Sullivan finds some bravery. He finds some autonomy. And I like that the rats are figuring it out for themselves. They're figuring out a new path. They're not just staying in one spot because that's what they've always done. They are being brave and learning what it's like to be rats that aren't bringing attention to themselves. They even say like we won't leave tracks. No one will know we were here. They realize they have to hide what they are because what they are is, I don't want to say it's terrifying, but it's conspicuous, and it makes them very different. And they have to learn how to be who they are on their own, and they're doing that. And it seems like they have a leader who's a little bit more in the middle of all of the options, which I think is great. Um, the mice aren't living with the rats because they're very different cultures, the mice and the rats. And so to have them together would be kind of weird because I do feel like part of Jonathan not telling her about the rats and his experience was to prevent a dependence on the rats in a way that would make them conspicuous, in a way that would make them sort of caught in a spiral the way Jenner is, that they, at the end of the day, they're mice and they need to find their way the same way the rats do. And so I like that they're friends, but they're not joining communities, they're not joining cultures or anything like that. And even she says, when will we see the rats again? Maybe when you're older, because, these rats are something, they're a lot to take in. They're a lot to understand. And the way that children are now, there's a lot to unpack there. How did father die? Well, he was trying to drug a cat so his rat buddies could steal there's a lot to unpack with that. And then of course, our lovesick bird has a cute little love story. And he shows up late after finding all of the string he's gathered, and now he can use the string to make a little love nest for him and his lady crow. So it's a very sweet, a very hopeful ending, and the disturbing parts of the ending seem like the inevitable for the characters that come to harm, basically. Like, if it wasn't today, Jenner was going to get himself killed somehow. Jenner would have probably been the first rat that Nihm found because of the hubris that is born of his superiority complex. So, if it wasn't this, it would have been something else. And at least, like I said, we have a little bit of a redemption for Sullivan, and we have retribution for Nicodemus.
We very much do, unless, I guess, Jenna might have met the end of the Grand High Witch in The Witches when she becomes a rat and gets killed by a Mr. Stringer, so he might have found his Mr. Stringer, I suppose. But I have talked to, I've looked at some folks online and their thoughts on this film, and have talked to folks about it. And the ending is probably the one part that divides people the most. And I completely understand why. Tonally, it almost feels like the movie crosses a threshold near the end, shifting from dark grounded fantasy into something far more mythic and symbolic. And for some viewers, that transition feels emotionally transcendent. And for others, it feels abrupt compared to the earlier tension and realism. Personally, I think the ending works best when viewed less literally and more emotionally, because this film spends so much time immersed in fear, fragility, suffering, and survival that the climax starts feeling almost spiritual, like the story is reaching beyond physical struggle into something about love, willpower, and moral strength itself. And the imagery becomes dreamlike rather than practical. Logic matters less than emotional truth in those final moments. And honestly, I think that choice fits the movie's atmosphere more than people sometimes admit. Even early on, the film already feels half-rooted in folklore. Omens, glowing objects, whispered prophecies, candlelit chambers, storms that feel almost supernatural. The ending, I think, simply stops pretending those mythic elements are sitting quietly in the background and lets them fully take over. What I do appreciate most is the sincerity of it. The movie never treats its emotional climax cynically or ironically. It commits fully to the idea that compassion and sacrifice and devotion possess real transformative power, In a lesser film, that kind of ending might feel sentimental. Here, because the story has earned so much pain beforehand, the emotional release feels cathartic instead. And at the same time, I do think there's a bittersweet tension in the ending that people often overlook. Even though hope wins, the film never entirely loses its melancholy atmosphere. There is still that lingering sense of displacement and change. The world remains dangerous. Loss still happened. The characters don't emerge untouched. And that lingering sadness keeps the conclusion from becoming overly neat. And visually, the finale is unforgettable. The lightning, the storm imagery, the music swelling into something almost sacred. It feels huge in an emotional sense, even if you can debate the mechanics of what literally happens. And I think the film stops operating like an adventure story and briefly becomes pure myth. And I think that's why the ending stays in people's minds for decades. Not because every plot detail resolves perfectly, but because it reaches for something emotionally enormous and genuinely believes in it. And that kind of sincerity is very rare, and is, of course, we often do find it when it comes to Don Bluth and the movies he has brought us. So I was very pleased with this. So this is going to be interesting. Let's get to If We Were the Academy segment. This film, lamentably, was not nominated for anything, but would have been eligible for the 55th Academy Awards, where the film with the most nominations and wins was Gandhi. So, Zan, do you think this film should have been nominated, could have been nominated, did it deserve anything, and why do you think it was overlooked?
It's overlooked because it's a cartoon. And do we didn't have a feature-length animated Oscar yet, did we?
Not yet, no.
What was our first year for that? Like 95, something like that? I mean, 90s.
So, yes, I think it was when Toy Story and so on were in that category. Yes, it was because of Beauty and the Beast, it broke the Academy Awards.
Exactly. So, because there were animated short films being nominated for Oscars at the time, but not full features, and that's why it was not noticed. This is an interesting one because Chris and I always joke around that whenever I'm watching a movie and I say, "Who did the score for this?" 9 times out of 10, it's Jerry Goldsmith. And this one is interesting to me because I was listening to it because Jerry Goldsmith is really good at like not sounding like himself necessarily. Where you have somebody like a Danny Elfman or a John Williams, where you're like, I think this is a John Williams score. He can be a little bit more of a chameleon for himself, but he wasn't with this. And there are some little, musical pieces in this where I'm like, boy, this really kind of sounds like Poltergeist, which is what he also got nominated for this year. So, working on these two pieces around the same time, I think, made them a little similar. It was one of the first times where I could say, oh yeah, okay, this is a Goldsmith. And as much as I would want to give Jerry Goldsmith a nomination for this, he's already got one for Poltergeist, which is a brilliant score. It does such a wonderful, it's like this one, where it does a fantastic job of sounding so sweet and innocent and childlike, and then becoming incredibly malevolent and ominous. And, John Williams' E.T. score is what won that year. Not my favorite John Williams, but it's a John Williams. I mean, even John Williams on a bad day is still better than anything I could ever hope to write. I remember being a kid and watching this. I watched this Oscars as a child, and I remember thinking, like, oh, cool, Gandhi won again, which means I get to hear the Gandhi music again. The score from Gandhi was really wonderful. And as much as I love Jerry Goldsmith, and as much as I love Paul Williams, who did the song, I could see this possibly getting a nod for Best Song. I still might not give it to it, though, because what won this year was Up Where We Belong from An Officer and a Gentleman, which is, kind of a big deal song. Based on what is in here, though, I would have probably given this to the Bergmans and Dave Grusin for It Might Be You from Tootsie. I love that song. But realistically, if something should have, like, Out of all the songs out of here, there is one incredibly iconic song that was nominated. It's Eye of the Tiger. Like this, the song from this movie is not going to beat out Eye of the Tiger. I would have probably given song to Eye of the Tiger still. Um, and we still don't have, I am hoping, I'll show my hand here a little bit, that I'm hoping we're going to start seeing some changes with the Academy, especially this year, because I think we've seen our best picture this year. I think it's Project Hail Mary. And I think that is going to probably push to the forefront the need for voice acting Academy Awards. Considering how much we're doing with motion capture and how much we're doing with voice acting, that I think that that is a long neglected. We finally got casting. Now we need to get stunt work. Then we need to get voice work. But I think that when it comes to if there had been an award for feature length animated movies, trying to think. I'm looking at everything else that came out in 1982. Remember, 1982 was that kind of dry period for Disney. So it wasn't exactly, there weren't any like, Little Mermaids this year or anything like that. I'm looking at other, like, as much as I love 1001 Rabbit Tales, it's a clip show. There's really not anything to write home about that from a originality standpoint. There's the Rankin Bass Last Unicorn, which is lovely. There are the animated sequences in The Wall, but that's not a feature-length animated movie. Even Tron was mostly rotoscoped. So I think if there had been an Academy Award for animated feature, I think this could have taken it hands down. Absolutely.
I'm right there with you. And interestingly, we had to wait 20 years before we actually got the first category for best animated feature-length film, which of course was won by Shrek in 2002.
Oh yeah, even later than I was thinking. Yeah, it was Shrek was the first one.
Yeah, because as we mentioned, yes, Beauty and the Beast was nominated for Best Picture in the 90s, but it took the Academy then about another 9 years before they or even 10 years almost before they were like, oh yeah, maybe we should create a category for Best Animated Feature because we can't have Beauty and the Beast.
I mean, especially if you're going to have Disney and Pixar and DreamWorks and, now we have Illumination Studios. I mean, there's so much good work out there these days. You absolutely have to, if you're going to recognize animation, you have to recognize the kind of acting that goes with it. I'm such a proponent for voice acting Oscars.
You and me both, and hopefully that will be the case. And yes, and as I said, it's crazy to think, yeah, we were 20 years away from that category actually existing, and hopefully more will come within this when it comes to animation. But yeah, I absolutely think that this film very arguably deserved recognition at the Academy Awards, especially considering how artistically ambitious it was compared to much of the animation landscape at the time. The difficult part, of course, is that animation in the early 80s occupied a very strange place culturally and industrially. The Academy, as we know, did not yet have a dedicated Best Animation Feature category. And animated films, as you were saying, had to compete either in general categories or hope for recognition in music or technical achievement areas. And as we know historically, the Oscars often treated animation as secondary unless it came from a very dominant studio or achieved overwhelming mainstream success. What
exactly.
Makes it, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and like I said, it was a weird time. It was an incredibly weird, what's the word? It was a weird climate. Because like I said, Disney was faltering big time. They were doing movies kind of like this, sort of weird and scary, but then not talking about them, things like The Black Cauldron. And then you had these weird sort of adult animated movies around this time too, with like Heavy Metal and Rock and Rule. So it was really sort of perfect timing for Don Bluth to come in and just remind us how gorgeous animation could be, because Disney wasn't doing it. Remember, Don Bluth started at Disney and left. Disney could have been this in the 80s, but Don Bluth left. And um, remember, we didn't get Studio Ghibli until like 1986. So even a lot of the Japanese animation that that is just beyond gorgeous that we got used to in the 80s, that still wasn't here yet. It was a weird climate for animation, and this movie just shines like a gem in the dust because of that, I think.
I 100% agree. And and also what makes that situation especially frustrating is that this film was doing things artistically, as you were saying, that were genuinely ahead of its time. The level of atmospheric lighting, the multi-layered effects animation, the detailed hand-painted backgrounds, and emotional tonal complexity was extraordinary. Don and his team pushed traditional animation toward a darker, more cinematic visual language at a moment when, as you were saying, much mainstream American animation had become comparatively safe and cost conscious. And honestly, if there had been a Best Animated Feature category, then I think it would absolutely have been a contender, maybe even a winner, depending on the competition year to year. I mean, it had artistic prestige, emotional depth, technical innovation, and a distinct identity. And those are exactly the kinds of qualities later Oscar-winning animated films would be praised for. As for other categories, the score by Jerry Goldsmith, I think, could easily have deserved more attention. The music is lush, it's eerie, it's emotional, and deeply tied to the film's atmosphere. And also the visual effects within the animation itself were also remarkably sophisticated for the period, especially the glowing effects and the layered lightning techniques. So when it comes to why it was ignored, I agree with you. I think partly timing, partly industry politics, and partly because the film existed outside the dominant animation narrative of that era. As you were saying, Walt Disney animation studios was going through a weaker transitional period in the early 80s. And American feature animation overall wasn't really being treated as a prestige field the way it later would be during the Disney Renaissance and beyond. And meanwhile, Don had just broken away from Disney, and this film was essentially an independent challenge to the industry standard. It was artistically bold, but not a massive box office phenomenon. And the Academy, as we know, often overlooks films that later become beloved because they didn't fit the immediate commercial or cultural narrative at the time. And I also think there's the simple fact that the film is emotionally intense in ways that probably, you had mentioned this earlier, it confused people's expectations of what animation should be. It's too dark for easy children's entertainment, but it was still marketed as animation, which many adults then automatically dismissed as juvenile. And I think that mismatch hurt a lot of ambitious animated films before the medium gained broader critical respect. Ironically, the movie's reputation, of course, has only grown stronger over time. Today, it's often discussed almost reverently among animation fans because it feels handcrafted, emotionally fearless, and visually rich in ways that modern audiences increasingly miss. I certainly do. And in retrospect, I think its lack of Oscar recognition feels less like a reflection of the film's quality and more like a reflection of how limited the industry's view of animation still was back in 1982. But, it's a shame, but, at least we're still talking about it. So I'm very glad that we are. So getting thus to ratings, Zan, what do you give the movie you selected out of 10?
Gets an 8.5 for me. It loses a couple of points for being terrifying and a couple of points for being a little bit racist. But it's really incredible. I love this movie. Like I said, I love Don Bluth. I love his movies. As scarring as they are movies that we will watch over and over and over again because they're brilliant storytelling and they're gorgeous and the characters are very deep and wonderful. And this is his first Don Bluth Studios feature film out of the gate after he left Disney. And when this is your first one out of the gate, and then you're gonna you're gonna follow that up with things like The Land Before Time and An American Tail. I forget which one's first. I think An American Tail is first. All Dogs Go to Heaven, Anastasia. I mean, these are some bangers of movies. And that this is your first one out of the gate is incredible. Oh my God, I forgot about Rockadoodle. I'm looking up his stuff. Rockadoodle is so cute. It's not a movie you see very often anymore, but it's so good. Um, and yeah, his movies are gorgeous. And this, like I said, the timing is sometimes everything. And unlike right now when there is so much animation, breaking in with something has to be incredibly spectacular. I think when he broke in with this, it was like, okay, Disney's left a gap. I can fill it. And I'm going to fill it with not only what's to come, but what made this medium as brilliant as it was in the first place. You look at his work on this with light and water, and it's the same stuff Disney was doing in Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, all of that. Um, it's really wonderful. Yeah, it's an 8.5 for me.
I 100% agree. And yes, these days, we are very much spoiled for choice when it comes to the brilliant things that come out of the animation world. Um, I would probably give this a 9 out of 10. Not because it's flawless in a mechanical sense, but because it achieves something emotionally and artistically rare. What elevates it for me is the atmosphere. Very few animated films feel this tactile and emotionally inhabited. The world has weight to it, as you were saying, dirt, rain, candlelight, illness, exhaustion, fear. You don't just watch the environment, you feel trapped inside it alongside the characters. And the film understands scale and vulnerability incredibly well, which creates tension that still works decades later. Visually, I think it's one of the most beautiful American animated films of its era. The hand-drawn animation has an intensity and texture that modern digital animation often struggles to replicate. And also, the lighting effects alone are astonishing. Glowing eyes in darkness, shimmering magical imagery, storm sequences, deep shadow work. Every frame feels crafted rather than manufactured. And I also admire its emotional maturity. Because as I was saying earlier, the movie respects children enough to let them encounter sadness, mortality, and uncertainty, and moral ambiguity without constantly reassuring them, and it trusts atmosphere and silence. It allows fear to linger, and it gives the emotional highs real power because the film never takes shortcuts to get there. And I think the characters help enormously too. Even side characters feel distinct and emotionally textured. Nobody feels entirely ornamental, and the central emotional core remains sincere throughout, which matters because a story this earnest could easily become overwrought in less careful hands. As we were mentioning, the score by Jerry Goldsmith is another huge reason the film lands so strongly, because the music gives this movie this aching, almost sacred emotional quality at times. It's one of those scores that doesn't just accompany scenes, it deepens them. The reason I stop at a 9 instead of a perfect 10 is mainly the final act transition into overt mysticism. I mean, while I personally think it works emotionally and thematically, I can still admit it's abrupt structurally. The film spends much of its runtime grounded in peril and physical struggle before shifting into something more symbolic and supernatural. I mean, I love the ambition of that choice, but I can understand why it disrupts the experience for some viewers. Still, even with that, the movie stays with me in a way more technically cleaner films don't. It has personality and risk and darkness and beauty and genuine feeling. It feels made by artists trying desperately to create something meaningful rather than simply commercially efficient. And honestly, that lingering emotional residue matters more to me than perfection. Some films entertain you for a couple of hours. This one quietly haunts you afterward. So it's a 9 out of 10 for me. And I agree with you, Zan. This was the first movie Don did on his own. It's almost like when you get those bands where the talent has left the band, goes solo, makes a solo album, and it outsells the band that he left. So right. Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
Don did.
Yeah, exactly. And listening to you talk about it, I think I'm going to have to change my vote to 9 as well because I'm realizing that part of my 8.5 was my own discomfort with this and my own trauma with it. But this movie gives the audience more credit than I think a lot of movies often do. And I think I made an emotional decision with that. I'm going up to a 9 as well because I feel like this is the kind of thing that kids need to think about. We think about the farmers who don't give Nim a second thought. Oh, the National Institute for Mental Health called. Like they don't even think about that. But this movie created a generation of kids who do think about stuff like that, who do think about what goes on behind the scenes, what goes on. If there hadn't been a movie like this, would there have been a Toy Story? The idea of what happens to inanimate objects when we're not in the room. Would there have been a Babe? Would there, there's all kinds of things that this movie teaches an audience to pay attention to that we hadn't necessarily paid attention to before. There have been little things before in literature like The Borrowers, things like that, but this really does shine a complex light on a lot of things that we as humans don't pay a lot of attention to. So, thank you for walking me through that emotional reaction. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And yes, but I mean, I agree. And also because it doesn't talk down to children. And that's something that I've learned thanks to movies like this. Like, even when I talk
That's
to my
my
5-year-old.
favorite thing about Don Bluth. I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No worries.
um, yeah, the Anastasia story is very captivating. That whole concept of, where's the missing Tsarina, that kind of a thing. But what happened to them is horrific. Kids love dinosaurs. Kids aren't really thinking about why we don't have dinosaurs anymore. I mean, the ending of that movie is heartbreaking. But we all know that we don't have dinosaurs anymore. But this movie is not sugarcoating that for kids. The dinosaurs died, and it's not like they all just died and stopped breeding. Something happened to them. Same thing with An American Tail. We have a lot of, it's an immigration story. Those are not easy. Those are, and that's the thing. There are cats in America. Spoiler. Things are not as easy as we think they're going to be when we've been, the land of milk and honey is curdled with bees too. It's not that simple. And Don Bluth has always said, kids deserve to know this. There's every kid has a dinosaur toy. It's not like they don't know deep down that there's no dinosaurs for a reason. And that's one of the things I love about him. Sorry to interrupt. Please go on.
Oh, not at all, not at all. But I think because of this and the fact that Don and his team never talked down to children when it came to hit the films from this studio, it allowed me to, I think, treat children with better respect as an adult. Like, as I said, when I talk to my 5-year-old niece, I talk to her as I would almost talk to an adult. I don't use coarse language because I don't think it's right to use coarse language in front of a 5-year-old. But still, the way I talk to her, I talk to her as if I were almost talking to a peer of mine, rather than using, almost baby talk to her, because I just feel like she's another human being, she just happens to be 5, but I'm still going to treat her as an adult, as because I just think it's respectful towards her. And so I hope she appreciates that. She seems to. So far, so good. It seemed to be playing my role as an uncle well. Speaking of thoughts and such, I guess let's get to what our listeners thought of this film, because we do have some gold standard feedback from the ever wonderful Dave Proctor. So, Zan, what does Mr. Proctor have for us?
Dave says, hello, cinephiles. Hello, Dave. I somehow missed this one too. Not surprised. Dave's a little older than me. Chris has never seen this one either. It probably came out when he was an older kid and was probably, again, from the indoctrinated mentality of cartoons are for kids. And so it probably just wasn't on the radar. Somehow I missed this one too. I enjoyed it. It wasn't earth-shattering, but definitely worth watching. The animation was top-notch and the story solid. What more can be asked? The secret message, since Nihm is National Institute for Mental Health, was that intelligence and mental health is capable of conquering everything life can throw at you. What a concept. I have been in search of intelligence and mental health my entire life. You may call it my life goal. I have heard great things. Alas, the search continues. I feel you, Dave. I agree. I think that should be everyone's goal in life, is to understand that we never stop learning and we never stop growing. And anybody who thinks that they are at the pinnacle of it, aka Jenner, it's not going to end well. So as long as you know that there's always something new to learn and always a new way to grow, I think you're going to be all right.
I definitely think so too, and always wonderful to hear from you, Dave. And of course, if you want to be like the wonderful Dave Proctor and share your thoughts on the films we discuss here, you can do so by shooting an email to goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Once again, goldstandardoscars@gmail.com. Be sure to follow us on our social media if you're not doing so already. You can find us on X as Oscars Gold, Facebook as Gold Standard The Oscars Podcast, and also Blue Sky as Oscars Gold. We love hearing from you guys, and we appreciate the follow and the support. Also, if you'd like to hear us discuss your favorite movies, you can join our wonderful family of patrons on Patreon and check out what we have going on there. You also get to unlock our previous reviews of such films selected by our patrons as Prey, Captain Phillips, Sense and Sensibility, The Illusionist, and many more. So to join our golden army, head on over to patreon.com/goldstandardoscars, and a big thank you to our wonderful patrons for their support. Speaking of which, this month, our patrons have selected Finding Neverland for us to review. And also, regardless of the platform you're listening to us on this podcast on, be it Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, etc., be sure to rate and review us, as that keeps the algorithm stimulated and allows our little show to reach more like-minded ears like yours. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your rats, tell your pets, we don't care. Just spread the good word. Big thank you to those who have done so. Future thank you to those who will. So, Zan, when you're not here discussing highly intelligent rodents, where can folks find you on the interwebs?
You can find me with our friend Charles Skaggs on our podcast, Drunk Cinema. We've been off for a while due to various reasons, but interestingly enough, when we come back, we should be doing The Dark Crystal. So we can go from there. Drunk Cinema, again, we watch our favorite movies over our favorite adult beverages and discuss them and record that discussion for your entertainment. Those can be found anywhere podcasts are found. If you're looking for me on social media, your best bets would be Instagram, TikTok, or Letterboxd. And my handle on all three of those is Udanax19.
Fabulous stuff, and I love The Dark Crystal, and so I definitely look forward to hearing what you and Charles have to say about that one. Also, when it comes to our missing third co-host, of course, Rachel, you can find her on the Five-ish Fangirls podcast, where her and her co-host discuss any and every topic from the female perspective, geeky and nerdy, because, as Rachel says, of course, fangirls are real fans too. And you can also check out their website, thefivishfangirls.com, where you can also then connect with their personal social media accounts as well. When it comes to myself, you can find my day job hosting the radio show Whiskey and Cigarettes, where we play the very best and nothing but the best of country music for you guys, from Alabama to Bailey Zimmerman. For more information about that, you can visit our website, which is whiskeyandcigarettesshow.com. Podcast-wise, you can find, if you're fans of those superhero films, you can find myself and Keith Bliss on Happiness in Darkness, the superhero movie podcast, where we do discuss any and every superhero movie and beyond, from, of course, DC, Marvel, etc. We recently, of course, reviewed Megan 2.0, because she does kind of become a little bit hero in that one. And coming up next, we're going to be carrying on with our Kung Fu Panda review, as we'll be reviewing Kung Fu Panda 3. And speaking of that Charles Skaggs guy, him and I can be found on the Fandom Zone podcast, where we recently reviewed The Punisher One Last Kill, the short film, of course, from the MCU. Coming up next, we're going to be staying in Marvel territory, but on the Sony side of things, as we're reviewing Spider-Noir, of course, starring the wonderful Nick Cage. And speaking of things to come on this show, next time, writer, actress, and director Noelle Wilson will be making her debut in the Gold Standard Theatre, and the movie she will be bringing is the 1992 Jonathan Lynn film, My Cousin Vinny. So 10 years since after The Secret of Nihm. So, Zan, anything else you would like to add on our upcoming movie or anything else before we sign off?
I do not need this right now. I do not need this. What else can we pile on top of this case? Not to mention, My Cousin Vinny is a fantastic movie, and all the haters out there that said the only reason Marissa Tomei has an Oscar is because Jack Palance misread it can suck it. She was amazing in this movie. It's it's really a wonderful gem of a movie, and I'm glad we're doing it. I'm excited for it.
I'm very much looking forward to it too. I do know Noelle was chosen because she is also a Brooklyn girl, like Marissa Tomei, and the fact that she won Best Actress, won the Academy Award, definitely inspired her to pursue, of course, an acting career and such. So definitely looking forward to having her on and discussing this film. So, of course, dear listeners, we will see you next time with My Cousin Vinny and on Patreon with Finding Neverland. Until then, enjoy those movies. Keep that popcorn hot. Big thank you to Dave for writing in. And all round, thank you all so much for the privilege of your time. Ciao. Bye.